Climate Change 2, Part 4, Greenhouse Gas Abatement Policy. Once countries have signed up for the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Agreement before that, then they have the problem of how do they design a national scheme to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a way that's efficient. The EU ETS is a cap and trade scheme that was set up in 2005, so it's probably the largest carbon market anywhere in the world, and it's also the one that's had the longest track record of trading, although as we'll find out, it's not without its problems. Australia has chopped and changed, so it started under Gillard with a carbon tax, which was in transition towards a cap and trade scheme, and then under Abbott it switched to a direct action plan where there's firms tender projects to abate greenhouse gases, and the cheapest projects are accepted. So we're going to look at these three schemes. There are many more around the world, but the EU ETS is the biggest one, and we live in Australia, so we'll have a look at what Australia has done. So the EU ETS, so the scheme has operated under three different phases. You could say the first phase, 2005 to 2007, was pretty well an experimental phase. Permits were allocated for free, and also permits weren't bankable, and we'll see later that this had an effect on the price. 2008 to 2012, there was a 10% reduction of allocations in this phase, and again allocations were free. And then the current phase, 2013 to 2020, major reform of the system, an EU-wide cap on emissions, which is reduced by 1.74% each year, and a large proportion of the permits are allocated by auction. And it's expected that the EU ETS will continue into phase 4, which will start in 2021 and run through to 2030. And the idea is that the EU ETS is there to guide Europe towards meeting its Paris Agreement obligations. Here we see what's been happening to the cap on emissions, and these are emissions from the largest polluters, so they're characterized by being large industrial plants, power stations, and so on. Cap on metric tons, millions of tons of CO2 equivalent has been progressively reduced over time, and actually the over the next 35 years, then the plan is to progressively reduce the cap even further, so that by 2050 then Europe is heading approximately towards being carbon free, which would. So let's just drill down into a bit more detail about what's been happening in terms of the cap. So during the first phase, then the cap was straightforward. It was just a limit on carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Then in the second phase, they introduced these offsets, the CERs and ERUs, which meant that companies could actually effectively purchase permits more cheaply by buying credits from elsewhere. And then during the third trading phase from 2013 onwards, then you see that a large proportion of the permits are actually now auctioned, and this is to try and increase the incentive effect of the emission trading scheme. When we start to look at what was happening to allowances, there was a change into 2008 when they moved into the second trading period, that greenhouse gas emission allowances were actually bankable. So you could under emit in 1 year and then use the permits to emit more in a later year. So what was happening on the market is that a large number of allowances were starting to build up, and if you have this happening in a market, then it tends to undermine the market price. And this happened was happening under the second trading period and the third trading period. Although there seems to be a proposal now towards the end of the third trading period to actually start to remove some of the allowances from the market, but that is politically possibly slight. But we'll now see the effects of this overhang to the market of banked permits. So this gives the prices of the EU carbon allowances in euros per tonne, and you can actually see from this that the EU carbon price is pretty volatile. So it looks, much like iron ore or wheat. It's prone to vary from day to day. So at the end of the first phase, then the price of those permits basically collapsed because they weren't bankable. Then we moved into the second phase and permits were bankable, but we had the economic financial crisis, so that led to a collapse in the permit price. And then Europe's economy was pretty flat for a number of years, from 2008 through to really up until the current day. Europe's economy has been pretty flat. So that meant that the demand for energy was reduced and the carbon price was depressed. And this graph doesn't go through to the present day, but if you pick up a copy of something like the Economist or the Financial Times, then you'll see that the EU ETS carbon price is quoted there, and actually this week it had suffered a pretty whopping reduction in price. So it had gone down by about €3 from about €8 per tonne down to just €4.6 per tonne. So currently the EU ETS is going through a pretty major price collapse, and in fact if you looked at what had happened from a year previous, then the price has gone down by 30%. So there's a bit of a problem here, that basically there are too many allowances for the demand of industry to purchase permits, and possibly also there's other ways that big industry can get round buying permits by having these other mechanisms that are equivalent to purchasing permits. So it's another case. It's a bit like sulfur dioxide. The scheme was reasonably well thought through, based on economic principles, but to be honest, it's been undermined by a massive financial crisis in 2008, which didn't help. But then by a structural problem with the market, that the number of allowances is just too high. They need they need to find a way of getting more of these allowances out of the market, because at a price of €5, then that means that that there's a fairly weak incentive effect on firms that are emitting greenhouse gases, and carbon prices in Europe are very cheap relative to what has been achieved through the Australian government's direct action plan. So this was a quote from a paper by Marku in 2016. The EU ETS is making a difference in establishing a price for carbon and incentivising, through its resilience and directions towards increased scarcity, significant corporate shadow prices. However, EUA prices, that's the allowance prices, at current levels cannot trigger operational medium to long-term change, which is triggered by other more costly measures which have other additional objectives, such as renewable energy policies. The need to find mechanisms to incentivise innovation must be a significant concern. So one obvious way around this is to introduce a carbon tax. Good thing with carbon taxes is that they're not volatile. They're fixed by government, and they're not subject to poor design, although they might be set too high or too low relative to the costs of environmental damage. So we turn to Australia. So this gives a snapshot of where Australia emits greenhouse gases. So the biggest polluters by far, or more than twice the other sources of pollution, are energy, electricity generation, and then stationary energy, excluding electricity, transport, fugitive emissions from the extraction process. So that would be things like leakages of coal seam gas, industrial processes, agriculture through the cattle industry, waste, landfill generating methane, and it gives a total emissions of 552 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So Australia is in this unhappy position of being a very, very high per capita emitter of greenhouse gases. So the first big policy initiative towards addressing this problem was in July 2011, when the then Labour government announced the Clean Energy Future Plan. The plan was to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the way that they were going to do this was basically through a carbon tax, although they called it a fixed carbon price, and the idea was that the fixed carbon price was to provide liable entities, which was the large energy companies, a period of stability while they adjusted to a carbon pricing mechanism, and they could get their emissions reporting and their compliance management arrangements sorted out. And then after that, it was going to transition towards basically a cap and trade scheme. So this is from a very good paper by Yotso 2012, where we see there the EU ETS, the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a Kyoto mechanism, which means that countries can pay for basically carbon offsets in developing countries. We see the plan to have a fixed carbon price and then to switch to a carbon market. But unlike the EU ETS, the carbon market was going to have a price floor and a price ceiling, and I think this was to try and address some of the problems that there had been in the EU ETS with market design, too many allowances, a problem of periodic price collapses, which is not really what you want with a greenhouse gas with a carbon market. Basically, you want some price stability so that firms get a strong signal to basically invest in innovation that reduces their carbon emissions. So Jotso was of the view that the carbon tax was actually a pretty good policy, and had a large number of advantages, both compared to a direct action scheme and also compared to the EU ETS, which had periodically run into problems, as we've just seen. The other thing about the Australia's carbon tax was it was going to provide this double dividend effect, in that polluters were going to pay, and they were actually going to pay quite a lot of money, in that around about $8 billion, and that money could be passed back to industry in free permits to trade exposed industries, industries like steel, payments to power producers to invest in ways of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, but also to the general public through higher welfare payments and lower income taxes. So here you have an environmental tax which is addressing an externality, which is then displacing distorting taxes elsewhere in the economy. So this was an added bonus for the carbon tax. So just a quote from Jotso: "Climate policy laggard Australia," so that's referring to the fact that Australia joined Kyoto quite late, "has adopted a carbon pricing mechanism with an initial price well above that prevailing in the EU ETS. The policy features broad coverage of emissions, managed prices, while phasing in emissions trading and politically calibrated recycling of permit revenue, including income tax cuts. These fact features could serve as a model for other countries' emerging carbon pricing schemes, but Australia's carbon pricing mechanism lacks bipartisan support, casting doubt over its political durability." So here we had Jotso, one of Australia's foremost climate change economists, really giving a big thumbs up to Labor's carbon tax. Unfortunately, it really became a political football in the election in 2014. So Australian carbon tax, rather sadly, took effect from the 1st of July 2014, and the justification it was that this will lower costs for Australian businesses and ease cost of living pressures for households. There was limited evidence that it was having a massive effect on households in terms of their costs, and lower income households were being compensated in any case by welfare payments from the tax revenue. So we now move on to the Carbon Farming Initiative Amendment Bill 2014. The primary objective of the Emissions Reduction Fund is to help Australia meet its international obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and meet its emission reduction target of 5% below 2000 levels by 2020. So that was Australia's first target, and there were other targets that. So it runs a reverse auction for projects to reduce emissions, and so firms tender to the scheme, and the cheapest tenders are selected on the basis of their cost of carbon abatement per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. It turned out to largely be based around forestry projects rather than including the big polluters, who are the energy sector. So it currently, I would say that this scheme is completely missing the mark. And here is an example of what I think is actually a really poor scheme, but that's just my view. So here's an example of a scheme that was tendered in from New South Wales, and it involves a farmer not clearing 7,000 hectares of forest on marginal land on his property. The farmer has committed to keep these forests standing for 100 years as an emission reduction fund project. In exchange, he receives carbon credits which he can sell back to the government. Right, so I think that in Australia now, pretty well no farmer should be allowed to clear 7,000 hectares of forest. So there should be basically federal clearing rules, although it would be a difficult policy to implement, but there should be federal clearing rules that stop farmers clearing any further bushland. There'd be a big question with this. If it's on marginal land, the chances are that this farmer would not actually clear the forest at all, so you'd question whether this money was well spent. Anyway, I don't know the details of this, but those are my comments on the face of this project. Overall, the Emissions Reduction Fund has contracted abatement of 189 million tonnes. You can see in the centre there that where the projects are distributed, so mainly over in the eastern states. Most of the projects are based around vegetation, landfill and waste. The amount that's been spent so far is 2.55 billion, and they've just got $300 million remaining, which is really peanuts. They've basically spent all their budget so far. The average price per tonne of abatement is actually reasonably low. I would say it's around about over the last three rounds between $10 and $11. One aspect of the scheme I do like is there will be additional benefits for protecting vegetation, which should be accounted for in this scheme. But in terms of meeting Australia's obligations under Paris, I still think that Australia has a long way to go, simply because they're not involving the big polluters. So this was a statement from the Federal Department of the Environment. The government committed $2.55 billion to purchase emission reductions. 5 auctions have been held so far, resulting in 435 projects securing carbon abatement contracts to deliver 189 tonnes of abatement at an average price of $12. This is helping Australia meet its 2020 and 2030 emission reduction targets. Over $300 million remains in the fund to purchase further abatement, i.e. peanuts. The safeguard mechanism, which commenced on the 1st of July, applies limits to large polluter emitters. This is to ensure that emission reductions purchased by the governments are not offset by significant increases in emissions above business as usual levels elsewhere in the economy. So they've just sort of woken up to the fact that because they're not placing an overall cap on emissions, they're just getting these tendered projects that actually the power generators could be significantly increasing their emissions, and so actually moving Australia further away from their Paris target. Now, I tried to get to grips with actually what's happening in terms of emissions and how Australia is tracking towards its target, and I think I'm coming to the conclusion that Australia is probably going to be struggling. It'll probably just about be able to hit its 2020 target of a 5% reduction relative to 2000, but actually meeting its 26% target by 2030, or its more ambitious 28% target by 2030, is really going to be extremely difficult for Australia, given its current policy approach, which is this extremely expensive direct action plan. And I sort of asked the question, how much money do they want to actually divert from, schools, health, to fund to fund greenhouse gas emissions, when they have this other option, which is to either use a tax or to use a tradable permit market. So to me, this approach just seems to be crazy, and is not really credible at the moment. They're going to have to try to get the larger polluters involved by one means or another, by command and control, or by some form of carbon tax. So just to recap, the EU ETS appears a sensible policy, but has been troubled by price volatility and low prices due to failures of designing the scheme. Australia's carbon tax was, in my view, a really well designed policy, and had the potential to guide Australia towards the Paris obligations. The emission reduction fund the emission reduction fund, that is direct action, is okay, but why not get the polluters to pay? It will become very expensive as the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions increases. So once you start to move away from these relatively cheap projects, then the marginal cost of abatement will start to increase, and they'll find that the direct action policy becomes more and more expensive as you have to attract schemes from more expensive polluters in terms of their cost of abatement. So review question: why is the EU ETS price currently so low? Why was the Australian carbon tax viewed by some economists as a good policy?